Today, we're going to learn about JavaScript functions. Let's get started. Hey there everyone, and welcome back to Web Development with Loop Coding Center. Today, we're going to primarily focus on the transition away from objects into functions, and we're going to do that for a pretty specific purpose. When we're actually going to end up going back to objects in the next episode, but for today we're going to learn about how functions function and how their inner workings will actually tie into objects, which we'll touch on in the next episode. So today will act as a great foundation to understanding JavaScript and how the functions, or things that actually make things happen that aren't just statements and declarations of variables, actually work. And alongside that, we'll learn of the syntax and the different types of syntaxes that are available within JavaScript. So with that, let's transition into the setup. So for today's setup, we're going to start with something pretty simple. Since we've already learned how to make statements, what we'll do is set three variables equal to x, y, and z, or named x, y, and z, and set them equal in order to 7, 8, and 9. With that, we'll have some variables to mess around with, and just for fun, we'll also throw in a variable a and set it equal to the string letter, just for now. With this, we'll have a couple of variables to mess with, and with that, we'll be able to identify what we're working with when we utilize these variables in our function. And with that, let's go ahead and transition into the syntax of a function. So to begin with the syntax of our function, we start with any simple declaration that you'd find with other instances. So for example, we're going to start off with the basic function that's offered in JavaScript. And you'll see what I mean by basic, and then we'll have our new ES6 expression that we'll explain later. So to begin, just like with a variable, we'll declare what we're making. So in this instance, it will be a function. And with the function, just like with the variable, the first thing we'll do is give it a name. So my intuition is going to tell me to name this my first function. And I'm going to do what's called camel casing here, where I'll take the first letter, keep it lowercase, because we save the uppercase types of functions for what will be later referred to as constructs. But for the time being, we'll start with a lowercase at the beginning of our phrase, and if there's multiple words in the name of our object or our function, what we'll do is capitalize the first letter of each new word. That way it's easier to read if you're just coming in fresh into the code, or you're showing the code to someone else so that they can help you work through it. Now from here we have the name of our function, but there's one last thing we have to add before we set the rules or the actual function part of the function. And this last section will be parameters. With parameters, you'll go ahead and set a pair of brackets or parentheses to go ahead and enter in a place for us to input data into the function for when we call it. This is because all we're doing right now is declaring and setting the framework for the function. Later, when we actually want to get the function to function, what we'll need to do is call the function by name and pass a parameter, or really pass a variable to the parameter in order to get a action to occur. So with this, what I'll do is go ahead and set a v1 and v2 as both my inputs. And now to go ahead and set some brackets for the actual space that will be filled with the function that we're creating. Now that we have our the syntax of our function set up, what we'll do is go ahead and create our first function. And in order to do so, what we'll do is actually start off with what we want to do with this function. As a simple example, what we'll do is set v1 and have it add up to v2. This will be the first line of our code. and we'll make sure to set this equal to v3, which will actually be a new variable. So in order to properly declare it, what we'll do is set var v3 is equal to var1 plus var2, or variable 2. Even though I have it as v, I have a bad habit of calling it a var, but we'll get over that, and you probably shouldn't pick the habit up either. Now with that, we'll also go ahead and console.log within our function in order to print out whatever we get from v3 whenever we call the function. And now that we have our first function set up inside of our variable, we, just to go over it quickly, have declared a new variable, v3, which is equal to the sum of v1 and v2. Then, on the following line, we have a console.log to print out the value of v3 for us. So, now we have our entire function with the functions we want it to produce inside. And now, to finally end it off, we'll call our function by calling it by literally just typing out the name, my first function, adding the parentheses, and then from here what we'll do is add the variables that we call in the parameters. So in place of v1 we'll take our variable x, and in place of v2 we'll input our variable y. So now if we go ahead and add a semicolon and inspect, we should see that in our console we get the number 15, which is the sum of 7 and 8. Now, I know I said I'd actually cover the other standard of functions that we have in JavaScript available to us, but I'm going to avoid that for today, just because I'd have to explain the complexities and the reasoning behind that different type of function. So today, I'll show you some common pitfalls that can come up when you're messing with variables. The first being what happens if you don't properly assign your variables or your parameters. And the problem with this being that v2 isn't defined, and even if we passed our variable, which is the variable of, let's say, z in this instance, we'll find that, well, it will pass the scope. But if you try and call a variable that's called within a function, outside of it, you'll run into this problem of scope, and that will be a video within itself. But here we already saw that because our parameter is where we declare a function, we'll run into this issue where if we declare a parameter, well, we declare a variable without actually creating a statement for it like we had to for v3, we just won't be able to use it because it doesn't exist. So always make sure to watch out for your parameters and to declare your functions within our variables within the function. Now let's go ahead and test something out. And I want you to take a guess before I do this. I'm going to, outside of the function, console.log the variable of v3. Now when we do this, we'll find that we've run into that issue of scope I was talking about. And that's because v3 exists within the scope of my first function, which the DOM, or the document object model, will interpret as a class or a property of my first function. And this is because functions in JavaScript work exactly like objects. In the last episode, we touched on the idea of remaking an orange as an object. We gave it different properties, and those properties allowed for us to call them individually when we wanted to. Because we haven't specifically declared the value of my first function and then v3, we'll find that just calling v3 will leave our program really confused because it doesn't know any context. Now, the final thing to note, and common pitfalls with functions, is the actually a pretty simple one that you'll run into when you're first starting. If you aren't passing a value to the parameters, you'll also find that, and let's go ahead and delete this console, you'll also find, and let's see if we can get it to print out, that it is not available. The function wasn't able to actually occur because it didn't have the proper parameters or the proper inputs in order to function. So with that, I want to have you guys re-review the functions and create a couple of functions for yourself. See if you can create a little text game with it. Because we'll save that for the if and else statements. But for the time being, mess around with the functions. See what you can do with declaration and just some simple math logic. And next week, we'll go ahead and bounce back to objects just so that we can transition into the area of methods within objects. But until then, have a nice week.